The morning Mamie Aldridge rode into Cutter's Bend with a bullet crease along her left forearm and a mule that had seen better decades. Every man on the main street stopped what he was doing and stared, because there was something about the way she held herself in that saddle, straight-backed and absolutely unafraid, that made a person want to know her story before she had spoken a single word. It was the spring of 1878, and the town of Cutter's Bend sat like a stubborn splinter in the thumb of eastern Nevada, wedged between the Silver Rush towns that had bloomed and withered and the cattle trails that kept pushing west. It was not a pretty place. The main street was a study in dust and ambition, a general store, a saloon called the Lucky Meridian, a land office that doubled as the town's unofficial courthouse, a smithy, a small church that leaned slightly to the east as if listening for something, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Cordell who had opinions about everything and kept them at ready, like a loaded rifle by the door. Mamie pulled her mule, whose name was Theodore and who had earned that name through sheer stubbornness, up to the hitching rail outside the general store. She unwound herself from the saddle with the practiced ease of someone who had been riding since before she could properly read, and she stood in the Nevada morning sun and took stock of the town the way a woman takes stock of a difficult situation, quickly, completely, and without letting anyone see what she was thinking. She was 26 years old. She had brown hair the color of creek water over dark stones, and gray eyes that people tended to remember long after they had forgotten everything else about her. She was not soft in the way that some people mean when they call a woman soft, and she was not hard in the way that the territory could make a person hard. She was something else, something that did not have a common word for it, though the word honest came closer than most. She had come to Cutter's Bend because her father had died 3 months prior, leaving behind a deed to a small piece of land 6 miles north of town, 40 acres of scrub and promise that he had won in a card game and never done a single thing with. Mamie had spent those 3 months settling his affairs in Utah, paying what could be paid, letting go of what could not, and now she had come to see what 40 acres in Nevada was worth and whether it could be made into something. She had no husband. She had no brothers. She had a dead father, a live mule, $80 folded into her left boot, a deed in her saddlebag, and more practical sense than most people twice her age. The wound on her arm was from 2 days prior, when 3 men on the road had decided that a woman traveling alone was an invitation. She had corrected that misunderstanding with her father's old Remington revolver, and she was not going to dwell on it, but she was going to need to get it cleaned before it turned sour. She pushed through the door of the general store and was met by a man named Holt Granger, who ran the place with his wife, and who looked at her forearm with the expression of someone who had seen worse, but was still concerned. He called his wife from the back, and his wife, a capable woman named Dora, cleaned the wound without asking too many questions and wrapped it in clean cotton, and Mamie paid for the supplies and bought flour and dried beans and coffee and a fresh box of ammunition, and she did not cry or make a fuss, and Dora Granger watched her with quiet respect. It was while Mamie was loading her purchases onto Theodore's panniers that she first saw Lionel Ramsey. He came out of the Lucky Meridian across the street, and he was not what she expected from a man stepping out of a saloon at 9 in the morning. He was tall, built long and lean the way trail men often are, with dark hair that curled slightly at the collar and a jaw that looked like it had been making decisions for a long time. He wore a plain brown coat over a blue shirt, and his boots were good leather and well worn, and he had a hat that had been pushed back on his head at the particular angle of a man who had been doing paperwork and did not realize it. He was carrying a ledger book, which struck Mamie as an unusual thing to be carrying out of a saloon, and he looked up at the street with the alert, scanning expression of someone who was responsible for things. He was 32 years old, though she did not know that yet. He saw her looking at him, and he nodded, the way people do in small towns, a simple acknowledgement that said he had noticed her without making it complicated. She nodded back, then finished tying down her supplies, and when she looked up again, he was still standing there. But now he was looking at her forearm and his expression had changed slightly. "That is fresh," he said across the street, not loudly, just clearly enough to carry. "It is," she said. "Dora take care of it." She did. He crossed the street then, which she noted he did directly and without hesitating, and he stopped a proper distance away and looked at her the way she had looked at the town, straightforwardly and without pretense. "Road trouble?" he asked. "3 men about 15 miles east on the Elko Road," she said. "They had different ideas about what was mine." "Did they learn different?" "2 of them did," she said. "The third one ran." Something moved through his eyes that was not quite amusement and not quite admiration, but held elements of both. "Lionel Ramsey," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it. "Mamie Aldridge. You just arriving in Cutter's Bend, Miss Aldridge, or passing through?" "Arriving," she said. "I have land 6 miles north. My father left it to me." He looked at her steadily. "Aldridge," he said again, like he was placing it. "Walt Aldridge's daughter. The same." He did not say anything unkind about Walt Aldridge, which she appreciated because there was plenty that could have been said. "I knew him a little," Lionel said simply. "I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you," she said, and meant it, and that was enough of that. She found that she wanted to keep talking to him, which was not a feeling she was accustomed to having about strangers. She was generally more comfortable with silence than conversation. But there was something about the directness of him, the absence of performance, that made speech feel easy. "What is it you do in Cutter's Bend, Mr. Ramsey?" she asked. "I have a horse ranch about 4 miles west," he said. "But I also do the land surveying for the county, which is why I was in the saloon at this hour. Hank Bledsoe uses the back room as an unofficial records office, and I was retrieving filed documents." He lifted the ledger slightly. "It is not as dramatic as it sounds." "It sounds perfectly sensible," she said. He smiled at that, and it was a real smile, not the kind that men sometimes gave women when they were trying to make an impression. It was the smile of a person who had been given something genuine and was returning it in kind. "I could ride out with you to your land sometime this week," he said. "Show you the survey markers, explain the boundaries, save you some confusion." "I would appreciate that," she said, and she meant that too. She watched him walk back across the street with his ledger, and she stood there for a moment with her hand still warm from the handshake. And Theodore turned his enormous gray head around and looked at her with the profound skepticism that was his default expression. "Hush," she told the mule, and went to find Mrs. Cordell's boarding house. Mrs. Cordell was a woman of 50-something with silver hair pinned in an elaborate structure atop her head, and opinions that she offered freely on every subject, from the proper way to make biscuits to the current state of federal land policy. She gave Mamie a room on the 2nd floor with a window that faced north, and she charged a fair rate and included supper, and she looked at Mamie's bandaged arm, and at the way Mamie carried herself, and said simply, "You will do well here, I think," which was not the kind of thing Mrs. Cordell said to everyone. The boarding house had 3 other regular occupants. There was a mining engineer named Fletcher Doyle who was quiet and methodical and spent most of his time out at the silver claims east of town. There was a schoolteacher named Agnes Whitmore who had come from Ohio 2 years ago and had stayed because the children needed her, and because she had found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she liked the wide open quality of the Nevada sky. And there was a young man named Pete Holt, no relation to the store owner, who was 17 and worked at the smithy, and was earnest about everything in the way that very young people sometimes are before life teaches them a different approach. Mamie settled into her room and unpacked what little she had, and she laid her father's deed on the small wooden desk and smoothed it flat, and she sat there looking at it for a while. 40 acres. She had looked at the map. The land had a creek running through the northern corner, and there was a spring-fed meadow that the survey notes mentioned, and the south section had good grass. It could be something. It would need work and money and time, and she had limited quantities of all three, but she had seen her father pour his life into nothing and come up empty, and she had promised herself she would not do that. She would be smart. She would be patient. She would be honest about what she had and what she needed, and she would go from there. Lionel Ramsey rode out to her land with her on a Thursday, 2 days after she arrived. He came to the boarding house at 7 in the morning on a big roan gelding named Copper, and he had brought a second horse for her since Theodore the mule was not built for the kind of terrain walking that a proper land survey required. The horse was a gentle bay mare with an easy stride, and Mamie mounted her without comment, and they rode north out of town in the cool morning air. It was a beautiful ride, even the difficult parts. The land was big in the way that Nevada land is big, not dramatic, not the sharp-edged beauty of the mountains, but the vast, rolling, everything under the sky kind of beautiful that takes some people their whole lives to understand, and other people never do. Mamie understood it immediately. She had grown up in Utah, which had its own version of this vastness, and she had missed it during the years she had spent in Salt Lake City following her father from one failed venture to the next. Lionel rode beside her, and he talked about the land in the way that people talk about something they love without realizing they are revealing that love. He knew the names of the grasses and the birds. He knew which rock formations meant water was close, and which arroyos flooded in heavy rain. He had been in Cutter's Bend for 7 years. He told her, having come out from Virginia after the war, he had been 15 when the war ended and had grown up in its aftermath, and the West had seemed like the only direction that made sense for a young man who wanted to start from the beginning rather than rebuild from the wreckage. "Virginia," she said. "Do you miss it?" "The green," he said, after a moment's honest consideration. "I miss the green sometimes. Virginia in spring is something. But not enough to go back. What keeps you here?" He looked out at the Nevada landscape with its browns and golds and the pale sage green of the desert plants, and she watched his face while he considered the question with the same directness he seemed to bring to everything. "The horses," he said finally. "The work I have built, and the way that out here a man is what he does, and not what his family name once was or what side his grandfather fought on. Every place has its cruelties, but at least here the score starts fresh." She understood that completely. "My father came west for the same reason," she said. "He just was not good at the fresh start. He carried the old weight with him." "A lot of people do," Lionel said, without judgment. "He was not a bad man," she said, because she needed to say it even though he had not implied otherwise. "He was just unequal to some of the things life asked of him. I think he knew that about himself. That is a generous way to see it." "It is the honest way," she said. He looked at her then, a quick glance that she caught and held, and something in it was sharper than the casual attention of a new acquaintance. She felt it land on her sternum like a warm stone, and she looked away at the horizon. They reached her land at 8:30, and Lionel showed her the survey markers, iron stakes driven into the rocky soil at the corners, with numbers on them that corresponded to the county records. He walked the boundary with her and explained the spring-fed meadow, which was everything the survey notes had promised and more. It was a green pocket in the pale landscape, fed by an underground seep that surfaced here and ran north into the larger creek before sinking back down, and the grass there was dark and rich, and there were wildflowers coming up along the edges. Mamie stood in the middle of it and felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt the specific kind of peace that comes from standing on something that belongs to you and knowing, in the reliable deep-down way that the body sometimes knows things before the mind has caught up, that you are going to be all right. "It is good land," Lionel said. He was standing a few feet away watching her. "It is very good land," she said. "What do you intend to do with it?" She had been turning this over in her mind for 3 months. "Cattle," she said. "Small operation. 5-6 head to start. Build from there. I have enough to buy the stock and get through the first year if I am careful. There is an old structure here," she pointed toward a low stone foundation visible at the edge of the meadow, "that my father apparently started and never finished. I can build on that." He nodded slowly. You will need help with the structure. I can do a fair amount of it myself, she said, and then because she was being honest, she added, but not all of it. I know a carpenter in town, he said, reasonable man, and I have hands at the ranch who do not always have enough to occupy them. I could send 1 or 2 out to help. She looked at him. Why would you do that? He seemed to consider the question the way he considered all questions, not as a challenge, just as something that deserved a real answer. Because you are new here and you are capable, and people who are capable of building something deserve a fair start, he said. And because Walt Aldridge did me a kindness once, a small one, and I owe it somewhere. It was such a clean and honest answer that she did not know what to say to it for a moment. I will pay your men fairly, she said finally. I know you will, he said, with that simple certainty. They ate their noon meal by the spring, the food that Mamie had packed in her saddlebag, cold biscuits and dried apple slices and a small block of hard cheese. And they sat on the flat rocks by the water and talked the way that people talk when they are getting to know each other, and both of them are good at it. He told her about his ranch, which had 20-some horses at present, mostly broken for riding and working, a few for breeding. He told her about the county surveying work, which he had fallen into almost accidentally and had discovered he had a talent for. He told her about the other ranchers in the area, the ones who were fair and the ones who required watching, and he told her about the politics of water rights, which were, in this dry country, more hotly contested than almost anything else. She told him about growing up in Utah, following her father from Salt Lake City to Provo to half a dozen mining camps before landing in Salt Lake again. She told him about the year she had spent working in a millinery shop in Salt Lake City after her mother died, when she was 19, learning how to run a business because the owner was an older woman who believed in teaching by doing. She told him about her father's decline after her mother's death, not dramatically, just factually, and about the strange freedom that had come with being the practical one, the one who managed things, even though it came wrapped in grief. You have been managing things for a long time, he said. It was an observation, not a complaint. I do not mind it, she said. I am good at it. I can see that, he said. They rode back to town in the late afternoon, with the sun behind them laying long shadows across the desert floor, and Mamie felt something she had not expected to feel so quickly, the tentative, warm-edged sensation of something beginning. She was too practical to make too much of it. She had known this man for 48 hours, and she had a homestead to build and a future to secure. But the feeling was there, honest and quiet, like the spring in that meadow, small and steady, and coming from somewhere deep. Over the following 3 weeks, Lionel was as good as his word. He sent 2 of his ranch hands, a young Mexican man named Carlos who was gifted with stone and wood, and an older man named Jerwood who had been building structures in the territory for 20 years out to Mamie's land with tools and supplies. She worked alongside them every day, driving out from the boarding house before dawn and returning after dark, and the structure rose from its old stone foundation steadily and surely. It was not a large house, 1 room with a sleeping loft, a kitchen alcove, a front porch that caught the morning light, but it was solid and it was hers, and she put her hands into every inch of it. Lionel came out twice that first week, ostensibly to check on the work but transparently because he wanted to. He would ride up and tie copper to the new hitching rail and roll up his sleeves and work alongside whoever needed an extra set of hands, and he and Mamie would end up at the edge of the day talking, while the light changed from gold to rose to the deep blue of Nevada dusk, sitting on the stone steps of the porch she was building. The conversations ranged wide. He had read a great deal, she discovered, and so had she, and they had strong opinions on some of the same books and opposing opinions on others, which was more interesting than agreeing would have been. He was more patient than she was, she could see that clearly, and she was more decisive than he was, which she also saw clearly, and somehow those 2 qualities fit together in the conversation like adjoining pieces of a puzzle. He had a way of listening that was unusual. Most people, she had found, listened to the words and formulated their response while you were still speaking. Lionel listened to everything, the words, the spaces between the words, the way a thing was said, and then he was quiet for a moment, and then he responded, and his responses were always exactly to what she had said and not to what he had been expecting her to say. It was an intimate form of attention, and she was not entirely accustomed to being the recipient of it. She began to notice things about him the way you notice things when you are spending time with someone, and you stop pretending that you are not paying attention. She noticed that he had a slight scar along his right jawline that caught the light in a particular way. She noticed that he was careful with animals, patient in a way that was clearly habitual and not performance. She noticed that when he laughed, which was not constantly but was not rare either, it was a whole-body thing, not just a smile. She noticed that he looked at her the way she had begun to look at him, when neither of them was trying to be caught at it. It was Agnes Whitmore, the schoolteacher, who brought it to explicit attention first. She and Mamie had fallen into the easy friendship of two women sharing a boarding house who found each other intelligent and interesting. And one evening when Mamie came in late and dusty from the building site, Agnes was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a book, and she looked up and said calmly, "That rancher has been in front of the boarding house 3 times this week." Mamie sat down and took her boots off. "He lives 4 miles west," she said. "He comes through town, specifically past this house," Agnes said with the precision of a schoolteacher. "You are very observant," Mamie said without inflection. "It is my profession," Agnes said, and went back to her book, and neither of them said anything else about it, but Mamie lay in bed that night and looked at the ceiling and let herself think about it with the same clear-eyed directness she applied to everything else, and she concluded that she was interested in Lionel Ramsey, genuinely and without reservation, and that this was a fact, and she would deal with it honestly. The question was how he felt, and she was not the kind of person to assume. She got her answer in a way she had not predicted in the 2nd week of May, when a man rode into Cutter's Bend on a lathered horse and brought trouble with him. His name was Devlin Crace, and he was the representative of a land investment company out of San Francisco, and he had a set of papers that he claimed superseded Mamie's deed to the 40 acres north of town. He had come first to the land office and filed his documents with Hank Bledsoe, and then he had come to Mrs. Cordell's boarding house and knocked on Mamie's door, and delivered the information with the smooth, practiced detachment of a man who had done this many times and expected women, in particular, to either cry or fold. Mamie did neither. She read the documents he handed her. She read them carefully and completely, standing in the doorway of the boarding house while Devlin Crace waited on the porch steps with the patience of a man who believed the outcome was already determined. And when she finished reading them, she looked up and said, "These bear a date that predates my father's deed, but the survey notation does not match the current county records. There is a discrepancy in the eastern boundary marker." Devlin Crace's smooth expression shifted slightly. He had not expected her to read the technical language. "That is a matter for the courts, Miss Aldridge," he said. "It is a matter for the county surveyor," she said. "I will be speaking to him today." She closed the door on him, which was satisfying, and then she put on her coat and walked directly to the Lucky Meridian and asked for Lionel Ramsey. He was in the back room with his survey records, and when she came in and laid Crace's documents on the table in front of him, he read them with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to everything, and when he finished he was quiet for a moment and then he said, "The eastern boundary notation is wrong. This describes a parcel that is different from the one Walt Aldridge deeded you. Either this is a different piece of land with a similar description, or someone altered the boundary numbers." "Can you prove it?" she said. "With the original survey records and the iron markers still in the ground, yes," he said. "It will take a few days to gather and document properly." "Then let us do that," she said. He looked at her across the table. "Mamie," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and something about the way he said it simply, without ceremony, like a person saying the name of something that mattered, made her breath catch for just a moment. "I want you to know that I am going to fight this with you, not as a professional service. As whatever I am to you." The room was quiet. Through the thin wall of the back office she could hear the low sounds of the saloon, a man's laugh, the clink of a glass, the scrape of a chair. "What are you to me, Lionel?" she asked, and it came out with more weight than she had intended, and she did not try to take it back. He stood up from his chair, and he came around the table, and he stood in front of her with the directness that was the central quality of him, and he said, "I would like to be more than I currently am, if that is something you want. I am aware that you have been here less than a month, and I am aware that you have significant things to deal with right now, and I am not going to press anything or make demands. But I want to be clear about where I stand, because I think you deserve clarity." She looked at him for a long moment. The clear-eyed, honest part of her that she had been listening to since she was 19 years old was saying something definitive, and she heard it. "I want that too," she said. "The more that you mentioned." He reached out and took her hand, and it was not a complicated gesture, just the placement of his hand over hers, and it was warm and steady and exactly right. "Then let us deal with Devlin Crace," he said. The next 4 days were busy. Lionel rode out to the land twice to physically document the boundary markers, making detailed sketches and measurements. He pulled the original survey records from the county files and compared them to the documents Crace had filed. Mamie organized her father's papers and found a letter from the man who had lost the 40 acres to Walt in the card game, which contained a description of the land that matched her deed and not Crace's documents. Hank Bledsoe, the unofficial keeper of county records, was a decent man who did not enjoy being used as a tool by land speculators, and when Lionel presented the discrepancy to him formally, Hank took it seriously. He sent a wire to the county seat requesting official examination of the conflicting filings. Devlin Crace, meanwhile, had set himself up at the Lucky Meridian and was working on the other ranchers in the area, suggesting that the same land investment company had interests in several parcels north of town and that cooperation would be rewarded. This was the part that worried Mamie more than her own situation. She had enough evidence to defend her claim, she thought, but Crace clearly had larger intentions. She brought this to Lionel's attention one evening when they were sitting on the steps of her nearly completed porch in the gathering dark, and he listened to everything she said, and then he was quiet for a long moment. "He is after the spring-fed meadow," Lionel said. "Yours specifically. The other claims are cover. Water rights in this county are that meadow, and the seep that feeds it waters several properties on the west side of your north line. Whoever holds your 40 acres controls a significant water source." "My father had no idea," she said. "He probably did not," Lionel agreed. "Crace's company did their homework better than Walt did when he acquired the deed." She thought about this. "So the question is whether I can hold the legal claim, and whether the county will uphold it over a company with more money and more lawyers." "The law is on your side if we document it properly," he said. "But you are right that money complicates things." She looked at the dark meadow where the spring ran soft and quiet in the night. "I am not giving it up," she said. It was not a dramatic statement. It was simply a fact. "I know," he said. "I am not going to let you." She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and the night air was cool and smelled of sage and the first hint of summer coming, and he lifted his hand and brushed a strand of hair back from her temple with the gentle, deliberate care of someone who was very aware of what they were doing, and she leaned into it just slightly. "Tell me something," she said quietly. "Anything," he said. Have you courted women before? Seriously, I mean." He considered this in his honest way. "Twice," he said. "The first was a woman in Virginia before I came west. She was from a family that my family knew. We were 17. It was more the idea of love than love itself." "And the second," a pause, "a woman in Carson City 5 years ago. She was determined to be what she thought I needed, which was a particular kind of woman, gentle, deferential. She worked very hard at it. But it was not what she was, Mamie said. No, he said. She was sharp and funny and had strong opinions about everything, and she kept all of it wrapped up tight because she thought it would not be wanted. We spent 8 months in that situation before she met a man who wanted all of her, which was the right outcome. I think she is happy now. He paused again. I had seen hard women and I had seen soft women, and by the time I was 30, I had decided that what I actually preferred were honest ones. She felt the words settle into her like something clicking into its correct position. That works out well, she said, and her voice was wry and warm at the same time, and he understood exactly what she meant by it because she was looking at him when she said it. He laughed the full, whole-body laugh she had noticed and catalogued, and then he pulled her close, carefully, mindful of her healed arm, and she leaned against him and they sat like that in the dark on her porch steps, while the Nevada sky opened up above them in its enormous, star-crowded way, and it was the most natural thing she had ever felt. The resolution of the Crace situation came faster than she had hoped, because of a combination of good documentation and an unexpected ally. The ally arrived in the form of Judge Thomas Hatch, who came from the county seat in response to Hank Bledsoe's wire, and who turned out to be a man who had spent 30 years watching land speculators use fraudulent boundary discrepancies to displace legitimate settlers, and who had very little patience left for the practice. He reviewed Lionel's survey documentation and Mamie's original deed, and the letter from the previous owner of the parcel, and he reviewed Crace's filing, and he conducted his examination over 2 days in Hank Bledsoe's back room with the thoroughness of a man who intended to get it right. On the 3rd day, Judge Hatch upheld Mamie's deed and dismissed Crace's filing, noting on the record that the boundary discrepancy appeared to be deliberate, which he characterized in language that made Devlin Crace's smooth expression go considerably less smooth. Crace protested and mentioned his company's lawyers, and Judge Hatch told him precisely what he thought of land investment companies that sent men to intimidate female settlers through fraudulent legal maneuvers, using language that was both judicial and forthright. Crace left Cutter's Bend the following morning, and the general opinion of the town, delivered via Mrs. Cordell's remarkable information network, was that good riddance covered it adequately. Mamie stood on the steps of Hank Bledsoe's land office after the ruling and felt the specific relief that comes not from avoiding a hard thing but from having fought it properly and won. Lionel was standing beside her, and he reached over and took her hand without looking at her, and she squeezed his fingers and did not say anything for a long moment. "Thank you," she said finally. "That was mostly the judge," Lionel said. "It was mostly you," she said, "and I am going to remember it." He looked sideways at her. "What will you do with the memory?" "Add it to the list of things I know about Lionel Ramsey," she said. "What else is on that list?" She pretended to consider. "He is punctual. He reads books and argues about them with some intelligence. He is good with horses in a way that tells you something real about a person's character. He does the right thing even when it requires time and effort. He makes good coffee." She paused. "He has excellent judgment about women." He made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something more tender than that. "That last item is newly discovered," he said. "The best items often are," she said. "The house was finished in late May. Carlos and Jerwood did the final work on the roof and the window frames, and Mamie whitewashed the interior walls and built a small kitchen table out of salvaged wood, and bought a stove from the general store that took 3 men and considerable cursing to install. She moved out of Mrs. Cordell's boarding house on a bright Saturday morning, with Mrs. Cordell pressing a jar of her best preserves into her hands and saying that the spare room would always be there, and Agnes Whitmore promising to ride out on Sundays when the weather permitted. She drove Theodore out to the land. Theodore had been keeping himself in a small corral behind Mrs. Cordell's boarding house and had developed an unlikely friendship with the widow's 2 cats, and she let him loose in the meadow and stood on her porch and looked at her house and her land in the morning light. And she was so proud of it, so deeply and fundamentally proud, that she did not know what to do with the feeling except stand there and let it be as large as it was. Lionel rode up at noon with a house gift, which was a cast iron skillet that he said had been in his supplies and was redundant, and which was clearly new. She accepted it with the dignity the gesture deserved and thanked him, and she made them both coffee in the new kitchen, and they sat at her salvaged table and drank it, and the light came through the east window and lay itself across the table in a long golden bar, and neither of them felt the need to fill every moment with speech. Over the summer, Mamie built her small cattle operation with the same methodical patience she brought to everything. She bought 5 head 2 cows, a young bull and 2 heifers, from a rancher 20 miles north who had a good reputation for his stock. She fenced the meadow and the south pasture and dug a watering trough fed by the spring, and she learned the particular daily rhythms of cattle management with the help of Carlos, who spent one long day showing her the essentials, and through her own reading and observation. She was not pretending it was easy. It was not easy. There were days in June when she came in after dark so bone-tired that she ate standing up because sitting down felt like commitment. There were mechanical failures and small disasters, and one afternoon when the young bull got through a fence section, she had not yet reinforced, and spent 3 hours demonstrating his opinion of that freedom in the North Meadow, while she chased him with considerable futility. It was Lionel who showed up at the end of that particular afternoon, having apparently been alerted by some frontier telegraph of masculine concern, and the two of them got the bull back into the proper pasture, using a combination of strategy and patience, and Lionel got a good bruise on his left shin in the process. And afterward they sat on the porch and Mamie laughed until her sides ached at the memory of the bull's expression, and Lionel laughed too. And it was one of those moments that a person keeps without meaning to, the kind that lives in the body, in the exact quality of the laughter and the evening light. He had started coming out several evenings a week, and she had started thinking of it as something she planned her day around, which was information she filed under the heading of things she knew about herself, alongside the fact that she was a person who preferred to understand her own feelings rather than be surprised by them. They talked about everything. They talked about the territory politics. Nevada had been a state for 14 years, but the eastern counties still felt like frontier, and the business of land and water and cattle and mining was being contested on every level from the local to the federal, and both of them had opinions and paid attention, and liked arguing the points with someone who took the argument seriously. They talked about the news that came in on the stagecoach. The papers were 3 or 4 days old by the time they arrived, and sometimes a week, but the world was still happening and they read about it and thought about it. They talked about books. They talked about horses. They talked about their pasts with the specific intimacy of two people who were deciding how much of themselves to offer to each other. She told him about a man she had known in Salt Lake City when she was 22 briefly, who had wanted to marry her but had wanted a version of her that she was not, the quieter version, the more deferential version, and she had said no to that, and she did not regret it. She told him about the loneliness of the years after her mother died, when she had been the managing presence in her father's life, and there had not been much left over for her own wanting. She told him these things without self-pity because that was not what they were just facts, the facts of her life, the material from which she was made. He listened to all of it the way he always listened, and then he said, "I think the thing that strikes me about you most is that you see yourself clearly, not harshly and not charitably, just clearly." "I try," she said. "Most people are either too hard on themselves or too easy," he said. "It is a rare thing to see yourself the way you actually are." She thought about this. "My mother used to say that honesty had to start at home, meaning with yourself. She was a very practical woman." "She sounds extraordinary," Lionel said. "She was," Mamie said. "I miss her every day." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the way he had begun to do, and she turned her hand over and held his, and that was that. In July, Lionel asked her to his ranch for Sunday supper. This was not a casual invitation. Both of them understood that going to his ranch was a different kind of step than evenings on her porch, and they both understood it without needing to say so out loud, which was, she thought, itself a sign of something. The ranch was 4 miles west, and it was beautiful in the particular way of a working operation that was also loved. The main house was larger than her homestead, naturally, built out of timber and stone over the years he had been there, and it had a long front porch with a good roof and views of a wide meadow where several horses grazed in the late afternoon sun. There were 2 outbuildings and a proper barn and a well-maintained corral, and everything was in order without being fussy about it. His housekeeper, a woman named Consuela who had worked for him for 4 years and who took Mamie's measure in approximately 30 seconds and apparently found it satisfactory, had made a dinner of roasted chicken and cornbread and green beans from her kitchen garden, and they ate at the big table in Lionel's dining room, and the evening was warm and simple and good. After supper, Lionel showed her the horses. He had 23 at present, a mix of working stock and breeding animals, and she walked along the corral fence with him, and he talked about each animal with the particular intimate knowledge of a person who has spent real time paying attention, and she watched him and the horses together, and the thing that had been growing in her chest for 2 months was making itself very large and very definite. "They trust you," she said. "I try to deserve it," he said. She looked at him in the last light of the July evening, with the horses moving softly in the corral and the big Nevada sky going gold and purple behind him, and she thought, this is a man worth knowing. Not because of what he had, not because of what he could do for her, but because of what he was, the particular quality of him, the directness and the patience and the capacity for caring that did not require performance. "Lionel," she said. "Yes." He turned from the horses to look at her. "I am going to tell you something, and I want you to hear it plainly." "I am listening," he said, with his full attention the way he always did. "I am in love with you," she said. "I have been for some time, and I wanted to say it directly rather than wait to see if you would say it first, because that felt dishonest." The last light was on his face, and she watched the thing that moved through it, not surprise exactly, but the deep movement of a feeling that had been waiting for its moment. "Mamie," he said, and his voice was different, lower and rougher at the edges. "I have been in love with you since approximately the 2nd week of May, when you explained a survey boundary discrepancy to Devlin Crace before 9 in the morning with a healed bullet wound on your arm." She laughed, and it came out warm and a little shaky. "That is very specific." "I am a surveyor," he said. "I am precise about these things." And then he stepped toward her and cupped her face in his hands and kissed her with the same quality he brought to everything honest and direct and full of intention. And she kissed him back with everything she had, which was considerable. They stood there by the corral fence in the Nevada evening while the horses watched with the mild curiosity of horses everywhere, and when they finally stepped apart, she was still holding the front of his shirt and she released it slowly, and she was smiling in a way she could not control. "Well," she said. "Yes," he agreed. Summer turned to fall, and the small cattle operation became more real and more rewarding. The cows were both in calf, which she had known was likely but which still felt like a small miracle of confidence when the signs became unmistakable, and she expanded her fencing and put up hay for the winter with help from Carlos, and from 2 other hands Lionel lent her without making it a question. The house settled into itself, acquiring the particular warmth of a place that is lived in and tended. She planted a kitchen garden on the south side and canned what she could not eat fresh, and she learned from her neighbor 2 miles east, a ranch wife named Cordelia Barnes, about putting up meat and preserving the vegetables that the short Nevada growing season produced. She and Lionel were together in the particular way of 2 people who have each found what they were looking for without knowing quite what to call it. They spent several evenings a week in each other's company, alternating between her place and his, and they rode together on Sunday mornings when the weather permitted, and they went to church together in Cutter's Bend on the alternate Sundays when they were in town, which the town noticed and approved of, because the town had been watching and had its opinions ready. Mrs. Cordell expressed her satisfaction to Agnes Whitmore over breakfast one morning in September. Agnes reported this to Mamie with the slightly amused precision of a woman who finds human behavior endlessly interesting. "Mrs. Cordell says it is about time," Agnes reported, over Sunday tea at Mamie's new kitchen table. "Mrs. Cordell has been saying something is about time since approximately the second week of my arrival," Mamie said. "She is usually right," Agnes said. "It is irritating." Mamie laughed and poured more tea. Agnes also told her, that same afternoon, that she herself had been corresponding with a schoolteacher in Ohio who was a cousin of a friend and who had expressed interest in coming west, and that the letters had taken on a quality that she described, with characteristic understatement, as personally significant. Mamie understood exactly what she meant, and said that she hoped it would develop as it deserved to, and Agnes said she thought it might, and the two of them sat in companionable understanding of the extraordinary ordinary business of people finding each other. In October, Lionel took Mamie on a 2-day ride north to see a stretch of territory that he said she needed to see to understand the country she was living in. A broad canyon system that opened up into a high valley surrounded by mountains on 3 sides, where in the fall the aspens turned gold, and the air had a quality of clarity and cleanness that he said was particular to that place at that time of year. They camped one night in the valley, and she lay awake in her bedroll looking at the stars through the aspens and listening to the night sounds of the place, the creek, a distant owl, the sound of Copper and Theodore contentedly cropping grass nearby, and felt the deep rightness of being exactly where she was. Lionel was awake beside her. She could tell by the quality of his stillness. "Are you looking at the stars?" she asked quietly. "I am looking at you looking at the stars," he said. She turned her head to look at him. The firelight was almost gone, just coals, and the moonlight was doing most of the work. "Why?" "'Cause you are—" He paused, and she waited, knowing he would find the right word. He always did. "You are magnificent," he said finally, not in a grand way, in the way that things are magnificent when they are exactly what they are completely. She held very still for a moment with the word landing on her. "Lionel," she said. "Yes. I want to stay," she said, "here in this place, in this what we have." "I want that too," he said, and his voice was very quiet. "More than I know how to say properly." "You just said it properly," she told him. He reached across the space between their bedrolls and found her hand, and they lay there in the aspen valley holding hands and looking at the stars, and it was one of those moments that is so complete in itself that you know while you are in it that you will carry it always. On the ride back the next morning, somewhere in the mid-morning hours with the canyon walls rising orange on either side of them, and the horses moving at a companionable walk, Lionel said, without preamble, "I want to marry you, Mamie." She turned to look at him. He was looking straight ahead at the trail, and there was the faintest tension in his jaw that told her this directness had cost him something, that he was not entirely certain, and she found that honesty in the uncertainty more endearing than any amount of smooth confidence would have been. "Look at me," she said. He turned. "Is that a question or a statement?" she asked. The tension in his jaw shifted into something else. "Both," he said. "It is a statement of what I want, and it is asking if you want the same." "I do," she said. "I want to marry you. I have been turning the idea over for about 6 weeks, and I keep arriving at the same answer." The tension left him completely, and what replaced it was something that she had not quite seen on his face before, the full, unguarded face of a man who is completely happy. It made him look younger and older at the same time. 6 weeks, he said. "I told you I was precise about these things," she said, returning his own line to him. He laughed, the full whole-body laugh, and Copper tossed his head in mild protest at the sudden movement, and Mamie laughed too, and the canyon walls threw the sound back at them in warm echoes. They were married in December. The ceremony was performed by the minister in the Leaning Church in Cutter's Bend, and the church was filled because the town had collectively decided that this was an occasion and had shown up for it accordingly. Mrs. Cordell had organized the reception at the boarding house, which was a feat of logistics that she carried off with the brisk satisfaction of a general who has fought the right battle. Agnes Whitmore stood up with Mamie, and Lionel's foreman, a steady man named Albert who had been with him for 5 years, stood up with Lionel. Fletcher Doyle, the mining engineer, brought a bottle of very good whiskey from Carson City, and Carlos and Jerwood, who had built Mamie's house, were both there with their families. Mamie wore a dress that she and Agnes had made together, deep blue wool with cream buttons, and she wore her mother's pearl earrings which she had kept through all the hard years, and she looked like exactly who she was. Lionel wore his good coat and a white shirt, and a new tie that he had clearly allowed someone else to choose, and he looked like a man who could not quite believe his luck, and was also entirely certain that he deserved it, which was the right balance. They stood across from each other in the Leaning Church with the Nevada winter outside the windows and said the words directly and clearly, looking at each other. And when the minister said the part about love and faithfulness, Mamie heard Lionel's voice go lower and more deliberate, and she understood that he was not just reciting. He was promising, fully and with everything he had. She promised back with everything she had. They kissed and the church made a collective happy noise, and Mrs. Cordell produced the first of several pies that she had been baking for 3 days. Mamie moved her things to Lionel's ranch after a brief, practical discussion about the most sensible arrangement. Her house, they decided, would not be abandoned. They would use it as a working base for the cattle operation during calving and heavy season, and eventually as a home for a hired hand when the operation grew large enough to need one. It was practical and it was right, and she felt no sadness about leaving it because she had built it and she was not leaving it. It was still hers. She had her things brought out in Lionel's wagon by Albert on a cold December morning, and she carried her father's deed and her mother's earrings and her books and her cast-iron skillet and Theodore the mule, who was given a fine place in Lionel's barn, and who regarded his new accommodations with characteristic mule skepticism before accepting them as adequate. The winter was mild, as Nevada winters went. They settled into the ranch and into marriage with the ease of two people who have been paying attention to each other, who understand each other's habits and rhythms, and who know where the difficult parts are and can talk about them. There were small collisions in the first weeks. She was more comfortable with decisive action than he was, and he was more comfortable with patient process than she was, and they learned to say so directly, and to find the place between those two approaches that was better than either one alone. They read together in the evenings by the fire, and they argued about books and about territory politics, and she helped him with survey calculations when the work was heavy, because she had a good head for mathematics, and he had discovered this and refused to stop using it, which she did not mind. He helped her with the cattle operations financial planning, which he said was straightforward in theory, and which she said was complicated in practice, and they were both right. They were very happy, not in the easy, uncomplicated way of people who have not thought about it, but in the way of people who know what happiness costs and have paid for it willingly and find it entirely worth the price. In early February, Mamie's 2 cows delivered their calves on the same week, and she and Lionel spent 3 cold nights in her old house by the meadow attending to the deliveries, and both calves survived and were strong, and she stood in the lantern light of the small barn she had built and looked at the 2 new animals stumbling to their feet, and felt the particular joy of something made real through effort. Lionel was beside her, his arm around her shoulders, both of them smelling of hay and cold air and cow, and neither of them cared about any of that. "You built this," he said. "We are building it," she corrected. He kissed the side of her head. "We are building it," he agreed. Spring came and brought with it several things. Agnes Whitmore's correspondent from Ohio, whose name was Martin Cross and who was a teacher of mathematics, wrote to say he was coming west, which sent Agnes into a state of careful, controlled excitement that Mamie found entirely charming. The cattle operation expanded to 8 head when Mamie bought 3 more animals from the rancher to the north, and she hired a part-time hand, a quiet young man named Ruiz who knew cattle well and worked without needing to be managed, which was precisely what she had been looking for. Lionel's horse breeding program produced 2 exceptional foals that generated interest from as far as Carson City, and he spent several days corresponding with buyers and calculating whether he could expand the breeding operation without overextending, which he and Mamie worked through together on the kitchen table with a lot of paper and coffee. It was in the middle of March, on a morning that had the particular quality of a Nevada spring day, bright and cold, and full of the scent of sage coming awake, that Mamie told Lionel she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen, simply and directly, over his second cup of coffee, because there was no other way she would have said something like that, and she watched his face while he heard the words and processed them. What happened on his face was one of the most moving things she had ever seen. It went through several stages: comprehension, then something that was pure joy so unguarded she had to catch her breath, then the quick practical concern that was characteristic of him: are you well? How do you feel? And then the joy again, coming back and staying. He set his coffee cup down and stood up and held her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt his arms around her and felt the quality of the hold, the care in it, the protectiveness, the fullness of the feeling he was putting into the gesture because he did not have words for it yet. "A baby," he said, against her hair. "A baby," she confirmed. He pulled back and looked at her, holding her face in his hands the way he had the first time he had kissed her, and his eyes were bright. "Are you happy?" he asked. "I am extraordinarily happy," she said, and she was without reservation. "I am," he started and stopped, and she could see him searching for the word, the precise right word, the way he always did, and she waited. "I am overwhelmed," he said finally, "in the best possible way. I feel full, like there is not quite enough room inside me for everything I am feeling." "That is a very good way to put it," she said. He kissed her, gently and thoroughly, and then he sat back down and picked up his coffee, and she could see him trying to arrange his face into normal morning configuration, and failing completely. A smile kept breaking through, and she sat across from him and drank her coffee and smiled at him every time he failed, which was often. The pregnancy was straightforward, and after the first difficult weeks of morning nausea that made early rising a complicated proposition, Mamie felt well and continued working with modest adjustments. Lionel was attentive without being overbearing, which was a balance she had told him clearly that she needed, and he had heard her and found it. He learned which concerns were worth raising, and which were the kind that a healthy woman growing a healthy baby did not need to hear twice, and he managed this so well that she told him he had a gift for it, and he said he had simply been paying attention to her for a year. Martin Cross arrived in Cutter's Bend in April, and he was a tall, quietly spoken man with an earnest face and spectacles, and the particular quality of a person who is not easily impressed by surfaces, but attends deeply to substance. Agnes met him at the stage with a composed expression that did not quite conceal the fact that she was nervous, which Mamie, watching from across the street, found enormously sweet. By the end of the first week, the quality of Agnes's composure had changed, become warmer and more alive, and by the end of the second week Martin Cross had talked to the school board about a second teaching position for the fall term, which told everyone in Cutter's Bend everything they needed to know. Summer was rich and busy. The hay went up and the cattle prospered, and the horses Lionel had sold in the spring brought prices that exceeded what he had estimated, and the land itself, Nevada in the high summer, big and dry and spectacular, was something that Mamie never stopped being grateful for. She sat on the wide front porch in the evenings when the day's work was done, and she looked out at the meadow where Copper and 3 other horses grazed, and at the mountains in the far distance going purple with the last light, and she felt the kind of gratitude that does not announce itself but lives in the bones. Lionel would come out and sit beside her, as often as not bringing 2 glasses of cold water from the kitchen well, and they would sit with the particular comfortable silence of people who have learned each other well enough not to need to fill the air, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they just watched the light change, and either way it was enough. More than enough. In late September, a son was born. They named him Walter, for Mamie's father, and James, for Lionel's father, and he arrived into the world with a set of opinions about it that he expressed at considerable volume, which made the doctor and the midwife and Lionel, who was pacing in the hall outside the bedroom with the constrained anxiety of a man who has been told to stay out but cannot quite bring himself to go far, all exhale with relief. Lionel came in when the midwife opened the door, and Mamie was sitting up in the bed with the baby wrapped in the blanket she had made over the winter, and she looked tired and extraordinary, and she held out the bundle, and he sat on the edge of the bed and took his son for the first time with the carefulness of a man holding the most important thing he has ever held. Walter James Ramsey regarded his father with the serious, somewhat skeptical expression of a newborn encountering the world, and Lionel looked back at him with an expression that Mamie had never seen on his face before and would never forget: absolute, unguarded wonder. "He looks like he has opinions," Lionel said. "He does," Mamie said. "He takes after both of us in that respect." She reached out and put her hand on Lionel's arm where he sat holding their son, and the 3 of them were together in the lamplight of the bedroom while the Nevada autumn went on quietly outside, and Mamie thought, "This is real. This whole improbable, hard-won, honest thing is real." Walter was a healthy, vigorous baby who grew with impressive speed and who had, as Mamie had predicted, opinions. He had his mother's gray eyes and his father's dark hair, and he demonstrated from approximately the 2nd week of his life that he was going to be a person who liked to watch things carefully before deciding what to do about them, which was some combination of both of his parents, and Mamie took private satisfaction in observing the traits emerge. The winter passed with the particular warmth of a house that is full of life. The baby's sounds, the fire, the dogs that had been acquired somewhere in the past year, 2 of them, large and friendly and underfoot, the books and the evenings and the small domestic routines that are, Mamie thought, the actual substance of a life, the thing that is easy to undervalue because it does not announce itself. Agnes Whitmore and Martin Cross were married in November in the same leaning church, in a ceremony that was smaller than Mamie and Lionel's but equally full, and Mamie stood up with Agnes and watched her friend say her vows with the clear-eyed certainty of a woman who has taken her time and chosen well, and felt happy for her in the uncomplicated way that was possible when you were watching something real. The spring after Walter was born, Mamie's cattle operation had grown to 14 head, and she had hired Ruiz full-time, and added a young woman named Clara who had come to Cutter's Bend on the stage from Reno, and had a need for work, and had turned out to have a natural talent for the management of livestock that surprised everyone, including herself. The operation was not large by the standards of the big ranchers to the north, but it was sound and it was growing, and the water rights from the spring-fed meadow gave it a stability that the larger, drier operations did not have. Lionel's horse breeding had taken a serious turn toward quality over quantity, and he had established a reputation in the territory that brought buyers from as far as San Francisco. He had taken on a junior partner in the survey work, a young man fresh from a proper land survey education in San Francisco, which freed Lionel from the administrative portions that he found less interesting and let him focus on the work that required the experience only years in the field could provide. They had built something. Not grand, not the thing that novelists wrote about or newspapers celebrated, not the great dramatic sweep of empire that the boosters liked to sell in their pamphlets about the territories. What they had built was a life, solid and specific and full, the kind of life that is made of 1,000 days of practical work and honest communication, and the constant small choices to be true to what you said you valued. One evening in the early summer, when Walter was 8 months old and asleep in his crib, and the dogs were settled by the fire, and the long Nevada twilight was doing its slow, magnificent work on the sky outside the window, Mamie was sitting at the kitchen table going over the cattle operations accounts, when Lionel came in from the barn and washed his hands at the basin and came to stand behind her, looking over her shoulder at the figures. "The spring calves are going to put us well ahead of last year's numbers," she said. "I know," he said. He was not looking at the numbers. He was looking at the back of her head. "I have been thinking about a third hand for fall roundup," she said. "Probably sensible," he said. She set down her pen and turned to look at him. He was leaning against the kitchen doorframe, arms folded, watching her with the look she knew well now, the one she had been the recipient of for more than a year, the look that was simple and complete and said everything it meant. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I am just looking at my wife." She made a small sound that was partly dismissal and partly warm. "Your wife is doing accounts." "I know," he said. "She does them better than anyone I have ever seen, and she does them at the end of a day that would have flattened most people, and she has figured out in 1 year what some people spend a lifetime failing to understand about running a cattle operation, and she is the most remarkable person I have ever known." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "You are making it difficult to concentrate on the spring calves." "Good," he said. She laughed, and he crossed the kitchen and sat beside her and put his arm around her, and she leaned against him and they sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight, his face against her hair, the accounts lying half-finished in front of them, the baby sleeping in the next room, the horses in the barn, the cattle in the meadow, the vast Nevada sky pressing gently against the windows. "I want to tell you something," she said. "Tell me," he said into her hair. "I came to Cutter's Bend with $80 and a mule and a deed to a piece of land I had never seen," she said. "I came because I had nowhere else to go and something to prove, to myself if not to anyone else. I thought I was building a cattle operation." "You were," he said. "I was also building this," she said, "though I did not know it yet." He was quiet for a moment, holding her. "I was the same," he said. "I thought I was doing land surveys and breeding horses. I was also waiting for something I could not have named." She lifted her head and looked at him, close and dear and real. "I love you," she said, with the same directness with which she said everything that mattered. "I love you," he said back, with equal directness, and the words were simple and enormous, the way the truth always is. Outside, the Nevada summer evening stretched itself out to the horizon, the light lasting longer than anywhere else she had lived. The sky that particular shade of deep blue that came just before dark, and the land was still and patient and vast. And somewhere in it, the spring ran quiet and constant in the meadow of the 40 acres that had started all of it. And it ran, clear and cold and steady, the way things do when they come from somewhere true and deep, and do not have any reason to stop. 2 years later, in the summer of 1881, Mamie's operation had grown to 30 head, and she had built a proper working structure at the homestead where Ruiz and Clara managed the day-to-day, while she ran the business side from the ranch. She was expecting again. She told Lionel in the same straightforward kitchen way she had told him the first time, over his morning coffee, and his face did the same extraordinary thing it had done the first time. The progression from comprehension to unguarded joy, and she loved him for it as much as she had the first time. Walter was 18 months old and had recently learned to walk with the determination of a small general, and he and the 2 dogs had formed an alliance that regularly complicated the business of the ranch's more orderly operations. He had the word horse, which he applied to the dogs and to Theodore the mule with equal enthusiasm, and he had the word more, which he applied to everything else, and he had a laugh that stopped everyone in their tracks, a full, bright sound that seemed outsized for such a small person, and that Mamie recognized as his father's laugh made small and new. Lionel watched his son with the particular attention he gave to everything he cared about, learning the child the way he had learned the land, carefully, respectfully, with real interest. He was a good father. She had known he would be because of the horses, because of the patience and the care she had seen from the beginning, but seeing it in practice was a different and better thing. Agnes and Martin Cross had their first child, a daughter named Ruth, in the spring of 1880, and Agnes had continued teaching until late in the pregnancy with characteristic determination, and had returned to the schoolroom 6 months after Ruth was born, which the town had opinions about, and which Agnes addressed once and definitively, and then did not address again. Martin had settled into Cutter's Bend with the same quiet thoroughness with which he had settled into Agnes's life, and the four of them, Mamie and Lionel and Agnes, and Martin, formed the kind of friendship that is rare and lucky, the kind where all four people genuinely like all four people, and the evenings when they gathered at one house or the other were among the best evenings of all their lives. Mrs. Cordell told anyone who asked, and some who did not, that she had seen the whole thing coming from the first week, meaning Mamie and Lionel, and the town took this claim with the good-natured skepticism that most of Mrs. Cordell's claims deserved, which did not discourage her at all. The second child was born in January of 1882, another boy, larger than Walter had been and expressing the same strong opinions about the world from his first breath. They named him George, for Lionel's older brother who had died in childhood, and Henry, because it had a good plain sound, and George Henry Ramsey regarded the ceiling of the bedroom with the profound suspicion of a person who has just arrived somewhere and is not yet sure what to make of it. Lionel held him and said, quietly into the lamplight, 2 sons. Mamie was tired and full of the particular, triumphant exhaustion of a woman who has just done an extraordinary physical thing, and she looked at her husband holding their second child, and she said, "We are very good at this." He laughed softly. "We are good at everything we do together," he said. "That is true," she said, without a trace of modesty, because it was true. Walter, at 2 years old, inspected his brother the following morning with the serious scrutiny of an elder statesman, and appeared to arrive at a cautious approval, which everyone took as a good sign. The years in Cutter's Bend had their difficulties. Drought in the summer of 1880 had strained everyone's operations, and a hard winter the following year had cost the cattle operation 2 animals, and required Mamie and Lionel to work longer and harder than they had ever worked before. There were legal complications when a new county surveyor came in and tried to challenge the water rights documentation on several properties, including Mamie's spring-fed meadow, and Lionel spent 3 months in careful, thorough, unyielding correspondence with the county that was eventually resolved in the same direction. The Crace matter had been resolved, because the documentation was sound and had been kept sound, and Mamie's records were meticulous. There were also the larger things happening in the territory and the country, the politics of the territories and the states, the business of what the railroads were doing to the land prices and the cattle routes, the way that the world was moving and changing around the specific life they were building, and they paid attention to all of it and talked about it and made decisions accordingly, adjusting and adapting with the practical intelligence that had kept them both standing through everything the territory had asked of them. And there were the small things, which are the actual texture of a life. Sunday mornings riding out into the hills together while the children were with Consuela, the particular way Lionel looked at her across a room full of people, a look that was private and complete. The evenings when they stayed up too late talking and the fire burned down to nothing, and they were still at the table, coffee long cold, neither of them quite ready to let the conversation end. The way he brought her flowers in the spring, not the formal presented bouquet, but handfuls of whatever was blooming along the creek, held out with the simple directness with which he gave her everything. the way she could make him laugh completely and fully with a single well-placed observation, the way she felt, walking into any room, any situation, any difficulty, that she was not alone in it. In the spring of 1883, Mamie rode out to the 40-acre homestead on a March morning when the light was doing something beautiful with the hills, and the spring was running high from the winter snowmelt. She rode alone, which she still did regularly, and she tied the bay mare at the hitching rail that was 5 years old now and solid as the day Carlos had built it, and she walked to the meadow and stood in the center of it the way she had stood there on the first morning, in the early spring of 1878. She was 31 years old. She had a cattle operation that turned a genuine profit and was regarded in the county as one of the better-run small operations in the territory. She had 2 healthy sons and a husband who loved her and was loved in return with everything she had. She had the friendship of Agnes Whitmore Cross, who was one of the finest people she had ever known. She had a house that she had helped build, and a life that she had chosen and made with her hands and her mind and her will. She thought about her father, who had come west for fresh starts and had not known how to make one. She thought about her mother, who had been practical and strong and had not lived long enough to see what her daughter became. She thought about the woman she had been when she rode into Cutter's Bend on a mule, with a wound on her arm and $80 in her boot, and she felt for that woman not pity but deep affection, the way you feel for someone you love who has been through something difficult and has come through it whole. The spring ran in its quiet, constant way. The meadow grass was coming up green along the edges. A meadowlark called from the fence post at the edge of the property, and then again, the same clear note. She heard hooves on the trail and turned, and it was Lionel on Copper, coming up the track at an easy canter with the particular quality of someone who had decided to follow and was not apologizing for it. He drew up beside her and swung down and tied Copper next to her mare, and he came to stand beside her in the meadow. "Consuela told me where you went," he said, by way of explanation. "I know she did," Mamie said. He looked out at the meadow and the spring. "Do you come here often by yourself?" "A few times a year," she said, "to remember where it started." He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they stood in the spring meadow in the Nevada March morning, with the light doing everything it knew how to do and the meadowlark calling from the fence post. "Where we started," he corrected, gently. She thought about the morning he had crossed the street with his ledger book and looked at her bandaged arm, and she had thought, "There is a man worth knowing." She thought about the survey markers and the spring and the night on the Aspen Valley's floor and the kitchen table conversations, and the 2 boys sleeping in their beds back at the ranch, and the whole full, honest, particular life they had made. "Where we started," she agreed, and it was entirely right. The meadowlark called again, and the spring ran on, and the Nevada sky went about its enormous business above them, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and they were exactly where they were supposed to be, which was here and with each other and home.